Some Māori leaders are calling on King Charles and the New Zealand government to formally reject a legal concept Pope Nicholas V first pushed through in 1452 as a justification for colonisation. The doctrine of Christian discovery came into being 317 years before Captain James Cook set foot in this country, and 190 years before Abel Tasman and his crew became the first Europeans to lay eyes on it. But Māori and other Indigenous peoples around the globe say the doctrine was the basis used by all European colonising forces in the centuries that followed. And they say it's still causing damage today. Here's our Māori Affairs correspondent, Terina Kōwhai, with our latest Because It Matters story.
With the authority of the Almighty God.
The average New Zealander probably hasn't heard of the doctrine of Christian discovery.
All the islands and the mainlands found and to be found.
But Māori academics say it's crucial to our history and our future.
Understanding the doctrine of discovery broadly throughout education and just throughout society in general is really important for our progression as a country. We need to understand the injustice that we are trying to find our way out of in its entirety.
The doctrine said that when Europeans arrive in a land for the first time, they could claim sovereignty in three ways: discovery, consent of the people via a treaty, or conquest. They took control of the natives, who they defined as non-human, by either converting them to Christianity, enslaving or killing them. Claire Charters from the Human Rights Commission says the doctrine of discovery was the legal grounds by which the British claimed the South Island. They used Te Tiriti o Waitangi to justify their actions in the North Island, but
as we know, under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, there was no cession of sovereignty. In fact, quite the opposite, the retention of Tino Rangatiratanga by Māori.
Raising the question, how did the Crown acquire sovereignty?
The only doctrine in which you can apply would be the doctrine of discovery to, I guess, legalise that claim to sovereignty. So yeah, it's the basis.
The practice of colonisation under the auspices of the doctrine became international law.
That set a context for worldwide imperial expansion by Europe based upon these ideas of European supremacy and that Indigenous peoples were destined to be enslaved and Europeans were destined to conquer.
And it was used as a precedent in New Zealand domestic law up to as recently as 2003.
And that really sets the context for the dominant form of racism that we experience here in Aotearoa and that exists around the world.
That's why King Charles is being asked by Māori leaders and Indigenous groups around the globe to formally reject the doctrine of discovery. Although New Zealand historian Paul Moon is adamant there is no need.
Basically, the people who call for that are completely wrong. This is an area where historians don't disagree. They're very clear about it. The doctrine of discovery is a Catholic doctrine going back to the 1400s.
The important word there is Catholic. The British missionaries and most of the settlers in New Zealand weren't Catholic. They were Church of England or Anglican.
It has absolutely nothing to do with British colonisation here in the 17 and 1800s.
But Iwi Chair's Forum rep Tina Ngata says it's trickled down through the centuries and across the religious divide. She's working with the government on the National Action Plan Against Racism and says the doctrine needs to be dealt with.
Once it gets embedded in government, who creates the policies, that's how you get systemic racism. And systemic racism is really what creates the most harm. The bulk of racist harm sits in the systems that surround us every single day that leads to high mortality rates, that leads to hyper-incarceration and all of these other types of poor outcomes for non-white communities.
Last year, Pope Francis visited Catholic schools in Canada where there are mass Indigenous graves and apologised.
Profound harm or genocide was clearly made an impact on the Vatican.
In March this year, the Catholic Church rejected the doctrine. How significant is this?
It's absolutely massive, the symbolism of that and the pressure that puts on colonial states to reject the doctrine as well.
Protests against colonialism feature in royal tours to many parts of the Commonwealth these days. Charter says a rejection of the doctrine by the King would be difficult but profound. And she says the rejection needs to also come from the New Zealand government.
When the previous government signed us up to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it was specifically mentioned under the section that was about the doctrine of discovery that New Zealand's position is that the doctrine of discovery is not relevant to New Zealand and that the Treaty of Waitangi and the processes that we have around that are what's relevant to New Zealand. So that continues to be our position.
So what are the chances of the King rejecting the doctrine of discovery? Newshub approached King Charles' representative in New Zealand, the Governor-General Cindy Kiro's office, for an interview, but it was declined. Te Rina Kōwhai, Newshub.